So just a disclaimer, this is actually only one part of a series I'm making that's going to be compiled into a larger video. So be sure to start from part 1, but also to look out for the entire compilation. Thank you for watching. Nen chart. Now that's the last of the general techniques and or information. So you might be asking, is it time? Oh yeah, buddy, it's fucking time. Everyone bust out your Nen charts and what Nen type am I quizzes. If you're feeling it, put your own Nen ability in the replies or something, I don't know. Because we are talking about the Nen types. For the sake of clarity, I will be reciting some of the stuff I talked about previously, even if I want to keep it brief when possible. Because there are actually a lot of misconceptions around Nen types. Before we go into the specifics of each type, let's start with the Nen chart. So as you know, there are 6 Nen types, and they are arranged on a chart in a sort of diamond-esque shape. I guess it's technically more of like a hexagon. Starting from the top and moving in clockwise order, we have Enhancement, Transmutation, Conjuration, Specialization, Manipulation, and Emission. Everyone is born with a natural affinity for one Nen type. What this means is that everyone has a 100% affinity/aptitude for one of these 6 Nen types, and 80% affinity for the ones right next to their category on either side, a 40% in the category furthest from them, and a 60% in the remaining 2 categories. So if I was a transmuter, I would have a 100% affinity for transmutation, 80% for enhancement and conjuration, 60% for emission, and 40% for manipulation. At this point, you're probably wondering why I didn't cover specialization, since one would assume a transmuter would have a 60% affinity for specialization because, like emission, it is 2 categories over from transmutation on the chart. Well, specialization is a unique Nen category that has its own rules and lack thereof. So a transmuter would have a whopping 0% affinity for specialization. Only specialists can utilize specialization, and I'll explain the nuances of that in greater detail later. So all these percentages are cool, but what do they actually mean for Nen users and the Nen chart? Well, according to Kurapika in chapter 108, each of these percentages are a rough approximation of how efficient a Nen user would be at utilizing any given type. It is possible to use abilities that do not fall under one's own Nen type, but generally it is best to try to stick to your own Nen type, or at least include said Nen type somewhere in your abilities if it involves multiple types. As you can tell by all these percentages thrown around, the farther a category is from your type, the less efficient it will be, meaning it will be less effective and weaker than if you stick closer to your own Nen category. Plus, learning techniques of Nen types that aren't the ones you have a natural affinity for will just take longer to learn. In chapter 108, Kurapika translates affinity to levels as a metaphor that could potentially imply that some kinds of techniques require a certain level of affinity, force, and accuracy for the Nen type to even use, or at least be effective in any meaningful way. I haven't found anything really expanding on this idea, outside of the idea that techniques become less efficient the lower your affinity and mastery for a Nen type is, in addition to Kurapika saying his chain jail doesn't work when his eyes aren't red. Trying to copy Kurapika's chains as an enhancer wouldn't make a lot of sense for most people because of the decrease in strength and efficiency in the technique. Not to mention that it would take longer to learn because the farther away a Nen category is from your own, the more time you would have to commit to mastering that category when compared to your own. A concept we see explored with Castro when Wing explains that the problem with Castro spending so much time developing a complex conjuration and manipulation ability with his double despite being an enhancer. The best example of the nuances in Nen type would actually be thanks to Kurapika's specialist ability, Emperor Time. Once again, I will go into specialization in detail later, but Kurapika is a special case in that he is a conjurer that becomes a specialist when his eyes turn scarlet. This gives him an access to a special ability called Emperor Time. There are a lot of fans who think this gives Kurapika a 100% affinity for every Nen type, but this is not actually what it does. As you can see above, what actually happens is he basically gains a perfect force and accuracy when using emission, but in respects to the affinity of being a conjurer. So he can use this as a convenient point of reference. If Kurapika uses Emperor Time, he gains a force and accuracy equal to that of a level 4 emitter, because, as a conjurer, Kurapika's affinity for emission is 40%. However, a level 10 emitter, i.e. someone with 100% affinity in emission, presumably in addition to the proper training, would still run circles around Kurapika's own emission capabilities, and potentially perform certain emission abilities that Kurapika couldn't. Even if Kurapika could outdo a novice enough emitter, someone who isn't good enough with the category, or someone who lacks a high enough affinity for emission. However, a special Togashi Yoshihiro exhibition puzzle exhibited in Tokyo on October 28, 2022 to January 9th, 2023 featured a Nen chart with some interesting placements. Also, I just want to point out that apparently, according to this, Alkago's an enhancer, apparently. Even though I'm pretty sure he's using conjuration and manipulation mostly. I'll let you ponder that one. That's... anyway, the Nen chart would be as you expect in many ways. It's in the same order as always with the hexagonal pattern. However, if you linger on it, you quickly notice that while plenty of characters sit directly on each category, some actually sit in between them to varying degrees. This might lead one to assume that it's possible to have some sort of dual affinity, or have a hybrid affinity split between two types, but this is not the case. It is only possible to have one affinity at a time, and even characters who change affinities, like Kurapika, are only one or the other at any given time. So, Kurapika is a conjurer most of the time, and when his eyes are scarlet, he is a specialist. He is not a specialist and a conjurer while his eyes are scarlet. What this chart is meant to show, according to my findings, is the idea that you can lean towards an adjacent affinity, but you're still stuck with whatever your natural category is. Let's take the butler Goto and our protagonist Gon for example. Gon is a quote pure unquote enhancer, while Goto is an enhancer with a lean towards emission. What this is displaying is the rates at which the characters learn and pick up emission and enhancement techniques. Gon learns enhancement techniques as fast as you would expect, and presumably Goto would learn enhancement techniques quickly too, but Goto would also learn emission techniques faster than Gon because of his own leaning. So a character that sits smack dab in between these two categories, like Franklin, isn't someone who has a 100% affinity in both or 90% affinity in both, but rather a 100% affinity in one and an 80% affinity in the other, like always. It's just the rate at which Franklin can learn and master emission and enhancement would be more even. Despite this, they would still have a primary affinity that follows the rules of the Nen chart placement. The character Bisky does actually make reference to these leanings in canon Hunter x Hunter. In chapter 148, Bisky estimates that Gon has a slight lean towards emission, since he seems to learn emission faster than transmutation, despite both of the subsequent categories being an equal distance from enhancement itself. And she mentions that he's way better at learning enhancement than emission. While not directly stated in the manga, as far as I remember, it does seem possible for these leanings to change, since while Bisky believes Gon to have a lean towards emission, Togashi places him as a pure enhancer. It's possible Bisky was just wrong, but since Gon went from skillful to extreme to Nen lost in the exhibition, there's the implication that how proficient one is with Nen can change, and it's possible that Nen type leanings are something that can also change over time or under specific circumstances, even if Nen types themselves usually can't. So on the screen what you're going to see is, here is a supposed translation I found of the puzzle on Reddit. I don't know who translated it, so I can't tell you if it's accurate. I didn't use it as a source, but it matches up with all my other info, so here it is for the curious. I will put a link for it down below. The puzzle also divides the skill level of each Nen user into 4 categories. From lowest to highest, it goes Skillful, Excellent, Natural, and Extreme. Gon is also given the level of Nen Lost after the stunt he pulled against Neferpitou. Characters like Bisky and Netero are classified as Extreme. Neferpitou, Mindyupi, Shiapoof, Hisoka, and Illumi are categorized as Natural. Nov and Knuckle are given the Excellent rank, and characters like Morel and Razor are listed as Skillful. Now this isn't a comprehensive list of every character and where they place, just me trying to give you an idea of what each tier is like, and who sits there. There's no evidence that these are the only tiers of skill. I mean, Gon has Nen Lost when no one else does, and Razor along with Morel definitely aren't pushovers, or that skill classifications like these are necessarily used in universe. I imagine these are for the sake of the exhibitionism and our convenience, since only characters with enough presence in the story seem to be placed. Rest in peace, Reed Island pirate NPC actor. Togashi will answer for what he did to you. Finding your Nen type. Well, what if you have a character that needs to figure out their natural Nen type? Are you just supposed to guess and see what feels good when you're trying to make your abilities? Well, this is where the water divination test comes in. There is also Hisoka's personality test, but the water divination seems like the most accurate test so far. The test involves getting a cup, filling it with water, and then putting a leaf on the water so it can float within it, as seen in chapter 60. You then put your hands around the glass, one on each side, but I don't believe we have ever seen someone touch the glass with their hands, before using Ren, Gyo, or any other technique that focuses enough ore into one's hands. This causes certain effects to occur, with each effect signaling the Nen type of whoever is taking the test, although we do see Palm create an effect that matches the result of an enhancer performing the divination in chapter 200 with a cup of coffee accidentally. Whether this means you can perform the divination with any liquid, specific substances, or water is just used to more easily determine the results, or something else is unclear. If an enhancer performs this test, the volume of the water rises. Transmuters will cause the taste of the water to change, emitters will cause the water to change color, conjurers make impurities appear in the water, manipulators cause leaf on the water to move, and if someone produces any kind of effect outside the specific ones listed, then they are a specialist. It also seems like certain effects can hint at the personality of the user or what abilities they should or can develop, especially in the case of specialists because their abilities could potentially be anything, and they don't always get to choose it. Okay, so in the original version of this article, I say that sometimes specialists don't get to choose their Nen ability. We actually don't know how often specialists get a say in their ability. It's never really clearly stated or shown, because sometimes people just develop Nen abilities naturally. For example, Kumugi's an enhancer, but she got her ability to help her play Gungi. So how much say specialists get in their ability is kind of unclear. And just to be clear, I know some people are going to bring up Morena and Borkson, because Morena's entire plot line is that Borkson is a specialist, and Morena wants to choose basically what ability Borkson will get by helping mold her and shape her and push her in the right direction. But the thing there is that Morena is accounting for her contagion, giving Borkson a specific ability. So we don't know if any specialist could do that. Basically, we don't know that if you got a specialist early enough and you help like mold and shape them, that they could develop the ability to basically whatever. That could just be because Morena has contagion. So, an example of what I mean regarding personality is that when 4th Kakin Prince Saradnik performed the water divination test, he caused the water to boil and release a putrid scent in chapter 376 that seemed to take even him aback. Although I suppose Saradnik might be an example of a specialist not choosing their Nen ability. He just got one naturally. This means he is a specialist, and this particular result is noted as being a very sinister omen. I'd go as far as to say that some of the results characters get when performing the water divination may have a bit of symbolism or metaphor to them. For example, Saradnik makes the water boil. The reason people boil water typically is to kill germs and disinfect the liquid itself along with anything within it, such as ingredients used in cooking. So you could see this as relating to Saradnik's goal to separate the supposed useful trash of society from the useless trash, and discard the latter. In essence, he wants to purify society in the same way boiling purifies water. However, the putrid scent gives a hint as to how malicious and destructive Saradnik actually is, and how he views society, since we know that he was both a serial killer and omega-level sexist. As pointed out by Twitter user at AOS863999742 on Twitter, it could also be a reference to the chapter of Revelations in the Bible, a chapter that includes a demon who falls to earth and poisons the water supply with its mere presence. As told in Revelations 8:10 through 8:11, the third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky on a third of the rivers, and on the springs of water the name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. Togashi is also no stranger to Christian iconography. I mean, there's a guy named Crollo Lucifer, and the Phantom Troop have a parallel to the 12 Apostles, with Hisoka being an extra Judas traitor. Also, one of Saradnik's Nembeast literally has a 666 on its belt / stomach, so the comparison to Satan or demons is not unwarranted. In the future, when I go over specific characters, do not be surprised if I bring up their result in the water divination test. There are some other examples I could bring up and theorize about. For example, when Killua performs a water divination in front of Wing after some training in chapter 60, he makes the water so sweet it's compared to honey. This could reference how Killua juxtaposes his more heartless family members, by literally being sweeter and more palatable, or just his extreme love of sweets such as chocolate. In the anime, when Gon performs the divination for the second time in front of Wing, he causes the water to not just overflow, but also begin to break the vessel, which could be possible foreshadowing to when Gon overdoes it with Nen by giving up everything and forcing himself into a grown-up adult form to face Neferpitou. In a sense, both these situations end up with Gon using too much aura and breaking a physical vessel, so I think the narrative does like to use the water divination as a bit of symbolism or character exploration. Also, yes, as I've implied, it does seem like the results of the water divination scale to how much aura is being mustered by the person performing it. If you're not proficient enough with Nen to perform a strong enough Ren, Gyo, etc., then nothing would happen. But passing this ambiguous threshold will cause changes in the water and / or leaf of the divination, with the changes becoming more pronounced the more aura is used for the test. Hence why Gon and Killua's results are more extreme the subsequent time they perform them after some practice. Hopefully you see some of what I mean. If not, I do plan to go over the various Nen types from not just a literal perspective, but also a potential metaphorical or narrative perspective, both when covering each individual Nen type and with our next method of affinity discernment. Unlike the water divination, by Hisoka's own admission, this personality test method isn't perfectly accurate, and he compares it to using something like blood types or zodiacs to figure something out about a person in chapter 62. He also implies he just sort of does it for fun / entertainment. Whether the comparison to blood type / zodiac personalities adds or takes away from this method's credibility can depend on who you ask, since to some this would mean the method is vague at best, if not completely inaccurate, if that's what we are comparing it to. But this is a world with invisible magic martial arts, so sure. And Hisoka not only accurately gauges Gon's Nen type during their Heaven's Arena battle, but also correctly deduces that Bisky is probably a transmuter in chapter 158, based solely on her mannerisms when she hides behind a tree. I actually won't go over the personality types Hisoka assigns to all the Nen categories in chapters 62 and 63 until I go through each Nen type individually, because I feel like it flows better, and it will be more interesting that way. There is a third and, as of now, final way of determining the Nen type of someone. However, this seems to be used after someone has learned Nen for a while and developed certain patterns or habits in their aura, as opposed to something being used early on in one's development. According to Furikov in chapter 370, it is possible to judge one's Nen type through observation alone with enough experience. It should be noted that these are very slight and minute differences, so not everyone has the skill needed to just eyeball someone's Nen type, and Furikov does also mention skill level, which implies that the results can be more or less pronounced depending on factors, such as skill level, and it probably isn't 100% accurate. By default, most enhancers and transmuters have a soft and quiet 10 around the part of their body that activates their favorite attack. Emitters and manipulators tend to have a broader 10 that will turn a shade darker if they attempt to shrink it. Additionally, manipulators usually want to keep the hand they use for their abilities free, and that usually ends up being their dominant one. And conjurers have a stronger 10 around the body part that activates their favorite abilities, but a gentler flow of aura everywhere else. Like manipulators, they usually want to keep their dominant hand free. We don't get anything for specialists, but I would assume given how varied the category can be and function from person to person, there isn't as reliable or consistent way to tell based on subconscious aura flow alone, since it would kind of just depend on the specialist in question, and it could resemble other nen types or look like something completely different. In Chapter 369, Furikov reveals a way to separate non-users from nen users too. The iris of a nen user shakes at its circumference/edge when viewed from the side. I have to imagine that, like with his method of defining nen types, these differences are very slight, since if they weren't, everyone would probably be trying to use them. But it's also possible that it's simply not a well-known method. The weakness of this method is that it cannot differentiate fully awakened nen users to those who are only half awakened. This would also lead me to assume that it doesn't tell you their skill level. What causes the shaking circumference of the iris is beyond me. Maybe it's the effect of the aura nodes or something else entirely. And we don't know if someone who can't see nen would notice these details in the iris of a nen user. And just to clarify, we know Furikov's method can't tell those who are partially awakened to nen and those who are fully awakened to nen apart, because in Chapter 372, Furikov is under the impression that Hulkenberg's bodyguards are just doing a really shitty job at pretending to be non-users, before it's explained that they were not taught nen or fully awakened to it by Prince Hulkenberg's nen beast. We can tell as the audience that despite the greater amount of aura they have, they don't know how to use 10 until they were taught by Kurapika. Now I finally feel comfortable enough getting into the individual nen types. I will be going in clockwise order of the chart, starting with enhancement. The exception to this will be specialization, since I feel like it will make more sense to cover it last. I will also be discussing the personality types Hisoka assigns each nen type, and I will not only be discussing the nen types with what they can literally do, but what they might symbolically or metaphorically represent in the narrative, and /or the characters that fall within them. I will also cover any misconceptions I feel are common or pertinent enough, and I will try to my best to emphasize the differences between each nen type.